They hang, suspended in the thickness of the water, like skydivers in freefall. Their almost identical underwater gear makes them look like a SWAT team. They never let themselves forget that water is a hostile environment, not suitable for human life. All of this to be able to enjoy diving to the fullest and to minimize the risk of not being able to make it back to the surface. But many Russian divers have often turned a blind eye to such strict rules. Their recklessness and thrill-seeking behavior have become legendary in the popular diving resorts of Egypt. For many Russian tourists, Egypt is where their first love for diving is born. Many, while on vacation, and often out of mere boredom, go for an introductory dive, then weeks or months later, return to complete the first phase of the diving course. And here, the luck factor comes into play. A good instructor will help you develop a lifelong love of the sea. A bad one, in best-case scenario, will change your mind about taking up diving. In worst-case scenario, will let you develop a hobby that will turn into a dangerous pastime, often with tragic consequences. The beginning of 2007 proved fatal to Russian divers. Several deaths in a row occurred during the weeks of Russian Christmas holidays in different parts of Egypt. Immediately, everyone began to wonder if these deaths were a result of a fatal convergence of circumstances, a misalignment of the stars, or a result of the mysterious nature of the ever-impulsive Russian soul. None of the incidents that took place in the early months of 2007 could name the exact cause of the divers' deaths. Official reports mentioned dire weather conditions or unfortunate circumstances. Members of the diving community mostly spoke about going over the allowed risk limit and the poor quality of training received by the deceased in relation to the complexity of the dive sites they were diving. On January 6, 2007, a group of 5 divers, including 3 Russians, a Dutch, and an Egyptian dive guide, rented a motorboat and headed out to dive Elphinstone Reef. The dive did not go well from the beginning. The guide had problems putting on his tank, and while he was taking care of that, he almost lost his entire group. Probably to make up for the lost time, he led them on a radically fast descent, and as a result, instead of going down to the planned 25 meters, the divers plunged straight down to over 40. The only person aware of this was Elena, an instructor who had an underwater computer, the only one in the whole group. The next predicament came when Michel, the Dutch diver, began to panic. He thought that the inflator valve on his BCD wasn't working, and that he was sinking. Panic sharply increased his air consumption, and within minutes he was on his way up to the surface with his buddy Dima, sharing air from Dima's tank. In the middle of such underwater mayhem, the divers probably neglected to pay attention to the current, which that day was not only especially strong, but going northbound against the wind. As a result, when the 5 divers surfaced, there was not a vessel in sight. Meanwhile, the skipper of the motorboat was desperately looking for the divers in the original spot of descent. The divers spent the whole day at sea waiting to be found. Floating on their backs, some tried to lightly work their fins toward the shore. Then, just before sunset, one of the Russian divers, Vladislav, decided to discard his gear and swim towards the shore with the remains of his strength. The others did not dare to follow. Several hours later, in the dark, Vladislav reached the shore, but the approximate location he gave to the rescue team did not help find the other divers. And none of these divers had any flashlights with them, not even small ones. A flashlight that malfunctioned during a cave dive near the Egyptian city of Nuweiba was the reason behind the panic and death of another Russian diver, Alexei Borisov. This incident also took place around Russian Christmas holidays in January 2007. It happened at the depth of 80 meters down into the cave, and he did not have a spare.
There were 3 of us there that day. Me, Alexei, and another experienced cave diver, Sergei. What happened was quite typical for a cave dive. It's just a tragic convergence of circumstances. Alexei started panicking uncontrollably, which really often happens to people inside a cave.
Another Russian diver, Alexander Nikitan died in January 2007 after diving alone to a depth of over 100 meters. This solo diver, as such divers are called, lost his weights while going back up and was literally thrown out onto the surface. He died from severe decompression sickness. In total, 7 Russian divers perished in Egypt just in the first 2 months of 2007. Each of these tragic incidents, with the possible exception of the death of the solo diver, shows evidence of non-compliance with standard diving regulations, or at least signs of being unprepared for handling emergency circumstances.
The educational systems are partly to blame for this, because they could not get across to the people the important point that rules must be followed. For example, when the Russian divers disappeared at Elphinstone, that was really very strange. They were completing their advanced open water diver Padi course. The diving circumstances were quite difficult. Everyone who's been to Elphinstone knows that there is a strong current there, especially in the winter. Open water. No bottom to speak of, meaning the slope is very steep. I think the problem here was that the course was being conducted in such difficult conditions.
The deaths of Russian divers in 2007 didn't stop at the January and February count. In November, 4 tourists from Barnaul went diving at that same Elphinstone reef spot. Only one made it back to the surface.
As soon as he came up to the surface, we asked him where his buddy was. He told us his story, which initially was summed up in 2 sentences. We were going in 2 pairs. The guys went down, and I didn't see them anymore.
From further details given by Vladislav Popov, it became clear that he, being the least experienced, was left behind at 40 meters. The others went deeper, to 90 meters. Standard practice regulations of any diving certifying organization prohibit diving deeper than 30 meters on a supply of only 1 tank of regular air. Any rule-abiding diver would be horrified to hear this story. It's well known that after 30 meters, there is a high chance of developing nitrogen narcosis. Divers can fall into a state of either euphoria or panic and behave and react inadequately. Besides, coming back up from 90 meters requires lengthy decompression stops, and 1 tank of air is not simply insufficient, but will undoubtedly lead to a catastrophe. In Russia, the news of their compatriots' deaths are often perceived as a kind of an evil destiny. Some even talk of the Elphinstone Reef curse.